Begin, Bharti ji.
A very warm good morning to everyone. I welcome you all to Gyanroot program organized by Department of College Education, Rajasthan. This is the online classes of English literature. My name is Bharti Singh and I am assistant professor in the Department of English. Today I am come here with the topic of romantic criticism. Friends, today we are going to talk about romanticism and overview, romantic criticism. Then we'll go on further with reference to William Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads, S.T. Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, and then there's going to be a recapitulation of all. Well, Romantic movement was a literary, artistic, intellectual, musical, religious movement that began in the Europe in the late 18th century. It was at its peak between the 1800s to 1815, and in England it began in the early 19th century. Romantic movement basically laid stress on emotion and individualism, and it talked of medievalism, and it discarded the classicism. It was also a reaction against the new classical movement, which laid a lot of stress on the values of emotion, on the values of following strict rules and regulations in literature and in poetry. And it followed very strict structural rules. It talked of dominance was there there was a lot of dominance on serious literature. Now in England, it began with the publication of the lyrical ballads that was written by William Wordsworth in collaboration with S.T. Coleridge in 1798. It was a collaborative work, and it was a work where there were 23 poems, out of which 19 poems were written by William Wordsworth and 4 were contributed by Goldridge. Goldridge, the lyrical ballads, first poem was S.T. Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and it concluded with William Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. Friends, the preface to lyrical ballads is considered as the unofficial manifesto of the Romantic movement. Now, when we talk of Romantic movement, the various characteristics are very prominent. The Romantic poets believed in the breaking away from the set rules that were laid down by the classics like Aristotle, Horace, and other Greek and French and Roman writers. So they believed that there shouldn't be any rules. In fact, the cardinal rule for the Romantic writers was that there should be no rule at all in poetry. They believed in return to nature. Earlier, till now, the new classical poetry was being written and it was confined to the clubs and coffee houses and to the elite class, to the political and social structure of the elite class of London. Now the Romantic poets, they believed in return to nature, and they believed in coming and writing the poetry that was about nature. They started taking interest in common life and started taking interest in the simple and the everyday activities of common man. Their poetry was more subjective, which is very contradictory. It was contrary to the new classical poetry. The dominance was on imagination and emotion. They believed that poetry should not be written with any artificiality. There shouldn't be any artificial language used in it, and the topic and theme should also be very liberal, and it should be very close to common man. The love of liberty and freedom. Liberty and freedom was the talk of the town. Like when the Romantic movement began, It was the time of French Revolution and Industrial Revolution. The basic tenets of French Revolution like liberty, freedom, and equality. So it was, in fact, the whole world was influenced by it, and even the Romantic writers. So they showed the love for liberty and freedom of the individual, and they were against the tyranny of any kind. They also focused on the theme of supernaturalism. Now, when we come to the critical works, in the Romantic age, we talk about William Wordsworth. Now, Wordsworth was primarily a poet and not a critic. His famous works are Advertisement to the Lyrical Ballads, Preface to the Lyrical Ballads 1800, Preface to the Lyrical Ballads 1802 with an appendix on poetic diction, Preface to the Lyrical Ballads 1815 with essay supplementary to the preface. Now you can see that a lot of changes kept on being made in the preface. And when Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798, his friends, Wordsworth's friends, advised him that he should write a preface, whereby describing about his aims and objectives and talking about his theory of poetry. Earlier, Wordsworth was not very much interested in it, since he believed that poetry or any kind of a poetical work should not be appreciated by writing a preface. He believed that if his work is of any worth, it will be appreciated by itself. Also, he felt that writing a preface in order to support his kind of work, his new type of poetry that he came up with, so that was not enough. It would not just adjust in one preface. However, he decided to write the preface of it, and there he wrote that any new and original poetry or any new or original work, if it has to be enjoyed, a taste should be created for it first. So it was a kind of an introduction to the new kind of work that they were coming up with, the new kind of poetry that they were writing. Most of the preface to the Lyrical Ballads of 1802, that is very important, and it is considered as the standard work in the literary criticism of William Wordsworth. See, basically, जब कोई भी नई तरह की पोइट्री आती है या कुछ भी नया काम आता है मार्केट में, कुछ भी, take any example, for example, anything new. Suppose anything new comes in fashion or any movie or any new idea comes up, people do not accept it so readily. So a taste has to be created for it. Therefore, writing of the preface proved this. And after he wrote the preface, it turned out to be great success. And his poetry was accepted by all, and it was very much successful in the sense that he had to keep on writing the prefaces. Though not much change was there in the preface, but additions and subtractions kept on going on till the preface of 1815. Now, till अभी तक जितनी भी पोएट्री लिखी गई थी वो न्यू क्लासिकल राइटर्स द्वारा, which was headed by Dr. Johnson, Dryden and Pope, ये बहुत ही रूल्स एंड रेगुलेशंस को फॉलो करते थे अपनी पोएट्री में. प्रॉपर डिक्शन होता था, एक स्ट्रक्चर होता था, और इनका मानना था कि अगर थोड़ा सा भी डेविएशन हो जाए रूल्स से, रेगुलेशन से, या अपने जितने भी क्लासिकल रूल्स अगर इन्होंने फॉलो नहीं किए तो वो अच्छी पोएट्री नहीं मानी जाती थी. वेल, जो रोमांटिक पोएट्स थे, विलियम वर्ड्सवर्थ, S.T. कोलरिज, बायरन, कीट्स, शेली, ये सब ऐसे पोएट्स थे जो रूल्स एंड रेगुलेशंस को बिल्कुल मानना पसंद नहीं करते थे. इनका मानना था कि पोएट्री को किसी भी बंधन में बांधकर नहीं लिखा जा सकता, इट हैज टू बी वेरी फ्री. और इनका एक बहुत अपोजिंग पॉइंट ये था ऑफ द न्यू क्लासिकल्स. न्यू क्लासिसिस्ट्स वर एक्चुअली इमिटेटिंग द क्लासिक्स. तो जब ये क्लासिक्स को इमिटेट करते हैं तो इमिटेशन में हम, देयर इज नो रूम फॉर इमेजिनेशन, देयर इज नो रूम फॉर एक्सप्रेशन, इनोवेशन, एक्सपेरिमेंटेशन. इनका मानना था कि अगर हम इमिटेशन करेंगे पोइट्री का तो आपका एक्सप्रेशन, आपका इनोवेशन, एक्सपेरिमेंटेशन की जगह नहीं बचेगी. So therefore they were quite they did not really go down well with this kind of poetry. तो ये अपनी type की नई poetry का अंदाज लेकर आए और this was romantic poetry. Now, from the critical point of view, we see the dominant theme of the 1800 preface is the poetic diction. Wordsworth कहते हैं the gaudiness and inane phraseology of the contemporary poets के ये against थे. He talks that, in fact, he objects to the vague, glossy, and unfeeling language. He believes that earlier the poets or the poets of the contemporary time, they were writing in a very exalted language. The language was so artificial that an ordinary man could not understand it. जब आप पोएट्री लिखते हैं और आपकी पोएट्री एक आम आदमी के समझ से बाहर है, तो वो उस पोएट्री का क्या फायदा? This is what the romantic poets believed. They objected to the vague, glossy, and unfeeling language. They felt that the poetry should be clear, it should be simple, it should be written in very simplified manner, so that even a common man could understand, could enjoy poetry. And it should be filled with emotion and imagination. तो जब ये सब चीजें थी नहीं नियो क्लासिकल पोएट्री में, तो वो पोएट्री इनके समझ से बाहर थी. There was a plea for simplicity in theme and treatment. So he asked for taking simple themes and treat them simply. Simple themes here means that earlier in new classical poetry, the poets were taking up very exalted themes, like they were talking about gods and goddesses, about mythological characters, and about the nymphs, and those characters that just did not match the common man's life. So they made a plea for simplicity in theme and treatment, and according to them, they should go for humble and rustic life. They felt that the treatment should be very simple and the theme should be taken from humble and rustic life, a selection of language really used by men. And the language that they should use should be the real language used by men. He also felt that the function of poetry is poetic pleasure. But till now, we saw that the new classical writers and the classicists, they felt that the function of poetry was to instruct and to delight. Poetry का function एक pleasure देना है, खुशी देना है. So this was their theme in the 1800 preface. He talks at length about the qualifications of the poet, and he says, in fact, he asks the question that who is a poet and what should be his qualifications. The poet is essentially a man speaking to men. Wordsworth feels that he is essentially a man speaking to men. Poet, he is not different from ordinary man in nature, but in degree. एक poet आम आदमी जैसा ही है, but जो उसमें फर्क है आम आदमी से, वो डिग्री में है, because he has some special qualities. He is gifted by God. Now let's see what are his qualities. He is a man who has greater and more lively sensibility. Poet एक संवेदनशील प्राणी होता है. He has greater power of imagination and he can imagine very well. And in fact, he imagines things which an ordinary man cannot think of. He has greater knowledge of human nature. He understands human nature very well and he knows the deep down emotions of human nature. He has a more comprehensive soul to sympathize with others and to feel for others. He has a greater zest for life. He has an excitement to live life, a greater power of communication. This is very important for a poet, since he should have a power of communication. He has a power of communication because he can communicate to his readers even the feelings, even the experiences that he has not personally felt. वो सब जो पोएट ने अपनी खुद की लाइफ में नहीं जिया, नहीं समझा, नहीं उसका खुद का पर्सनल एक्सपीरियंस हो, फिर भी वो अपने रीडर्स को इतने अच्छे से समझा सकता है, बता सकता है, as if he has felt it himself, as if he has lived it himself. So these are all the qualities of a good poet. When he talks of poetic pleasure, the poetic truth. What is poetic truth? He says that poetry is the most philosophical of all writing. Now, philosophical here means more conducive to understanding, a better knowledge, a better source of knowledge and wisdom. It is the most philosophical of all writing. He considers poetry as superior to philosophy. He considers it superior to history, to science, maths, or any other language. He says that philosophy deals with abstract truths and history deals with those truths of the past and it illustrates those truths. But a poet, he deals with the universal truths. His truth is truth to nature. This is very deep in understanding because he feels that poetic pleasure is universal, and what he feels is the poetic truth. It is when you're closer to nature, nature, you understand humans very well, and this is actually focused on his humanitarian part. And it is also superior to science and mathematics because a scientist, he toils hard to derive and to deduct the calculations and come to a certain conclusion. And this he gets enjoyment in that, he gets pleasure in that, but this pleasure is only for himself. The scientist enjoys it uh, while making calculations and deducting and coming to conclusions. This is all his personal enjoyment and enjoyment of few. But that poetry's enjoyment and pleasure is for all. Therefore, he calls it that most philosophical of all writing and the breadth and finer spirit of all knowledge. Wordsworth views on poetic diction, this is very important. There neither is nor there ever be. There can never be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. What he feels for poetic diction is basically he was against poetic diction, against using any fixed structure or vocabulary or any kind of a serious poetic diction, because he felt that if his characters are simple, then they do not need any artificial language. The only difference is that the poets use meter. Otherwise, prose and poetry are closely akin in the nature, appeal, and function. He actually supports the use of meter and he's against the poetic diction. He says that he himself has used meter and he attributes it to the tradition. He says meter has been used traditionally. Therefore, he is using it, and meter lends a sense of rhythm and music to poetry. Therefore, meter is nothing but pleasure superadded. Meter is not essential to poetry as Wordsworth feels. See, Wordsworth was also criticized for this by Goldridge and by other critics as well, because he was not very clear on why he should not use poetic diction when he is using meter. Now, the 4 stages of the process of poetic creation. This is a very important definition of poetry by Wordsworth. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It has its origin in emotions recollected in tranquility. Well, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. By this, Wordsworth means that poetry is something which comes from within. It is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. You have to have a kind of feeling, very strong, powerful feelings when you write poetry. It is spontaneous, it is not forced, it is not unwilling. It has to come out from deep within. It is not an intellectual work, it is a work of the heart. So he says that it is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. But then one more thing I must add here is that it is not that those spontaneous feelings came to you, you were overpowered with those feelings, and then you sit and start writing poetry. It's not that. It has its origin in emotions recollected in tranquility. It is actually the 4 stages which a poet has to cross, which he has to undergo to write good poetry. The very first one is observation. Now, the poet first observes something. He observes maybe a scene, beautiful scene, a character, or an idea, and then he forgets about it. It is a beautiful thing, something which he sees He absorbs, he perceives through his senses, and then it has gone at the back of his mind. Now, after some time, maybe a lapse of many years, after the lapse of time, when he sits alone in tranquility, in complete peacefulness, he recollects those emotions. He recollects that idea, he recollects that scene, beautiful scene that he has observed, and then he sits and contemplates over it. वो उसके बारे में सोचता है, उसको ऑब्जर्व करके अपनी फीलिंग्स को दोबारा से उसकी सेम फीलिंग्स आने लगती हैं. He relives that emotion and that feeling is overpowered so much so that he sits to write a poetry. He starts composing. See, the first step is observation. He observes something, something beautiful, some idea, character. Then he forgets about it. After many years, after a lapse of time, he recollects that idea, that feeling, that emotion, and he starts contemplating over it. It is a long process. And when this happens, when he's sitting in tranquility, see, it's written origin in emotions. It has its origin in emotions recollected in tranquility. The same emotions are erupting again, and they are so much so that he's overpowered with those feelings. He's reliving that scene, that character, that idea. And then now a filtration takes place. He filters all those that is gaudy, that is unnatural, that is which is, he has to make a filter, and he has to use the good words, the real language of the men. He has to make a selection, and then he starts the composition of the poetry. Now, coming to S.T. Goldridge and his Biographia Literaria. Goldridge was a great poet. He was a philosopher and a great critic as well. His Autobiographia Literaria is an autobiographical work, and it has got 23 chapters, out of which the 16 chapters are mostly his philosophizing, and the rest of the 7 chapters mainly contains his critical work. Goldridge's work is very scattered. It is all sprawling, and it is nothing fixed is written anywhere, and we get to see his work in a very it is only the Biographia Literaria which we consider as critical work, and nothing is complete. In fact, he used to write when he was in fits, and since he was an opium eater, the only complete work is his Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and rest all is scattered work. His Biographia Literaria was published in 1817, and the idea was that he would write a preface to Sibylline Leaves. Basically, this Biographia Literaria was to be in the form of a preface to Sibylline Leaves. Sibylline Leaves was again a poetic collection of S.T. Coleridge. But then when he sat to write on the preface, he wrote it so much so that it became almost a book. Therefore, Biographia Literaria is written in 2 parts. He expounded his seminal theory of imagination and fancy in this book. Very important terms: imagination, primary imagination and secondary imagination, which is propounded by S.T. Goldridge. He says that there are 2 kinds of imagination: primary imagination and secondary imagination. 2 तरह की imagination होती है, एक primary imagination और secondary imagination. Primary imagination हम सबके पास है, but secondary imagination बहुत ही कम लोगों के पास है. Let's see how. Primary imagination is actually the expressions of the external world that we perceive through our senses. Now, these expressions, they are settled in our minds, and then mind plays on it and creates images, and it makes a clear picture. Whereas secondary imagination, for secondary imagination, the raw material comes from the primary imagination. In secondary imagination, it is actually the conscious will of the person. It is basically assumed that only poets, artists, and very creative people have the secondary imagination. Primary imagination, everyone has, it is universal in nature, whereas secondary imagination is the attribute of only a few. Let's see what it is here. It is the power of receiving impressions from the external world through the senses. It is involuntary act of mind. We all perceive things and we settle it somewhere in our minds through our senses. It goes and it is involuntary act. हमारा इस पर कोई जोर नहीं है. हम जो भी देखते हैं वो ऑटोमेटिकली हमारे दिमाग में कहीं ना कहीं सेटल हो जाता है. Primary imagination is universal. हम सबके पास है primary imagination. Secondary imagination works upon primary imagination. जो भी primary imagination में रखा हुआ है वो सब उस पर काम अगर कुछ करता है तो secondary imagination. For example, when we see a beautiful scene, suppose rain falling, blooming of a flower, sun setting, sun rising, anything, any beautiful scene when we see, हम सब ने देखी है वो चीज और हम सब उसको एंजॉय हमने देखी है और इट गोज इन सेटल समवेयर इन आवर माइंड. ये हुई प्राइमरी इमेजिनेशन. बट इट इज ओनली द पोएट हु विल वर्क अपॉन दिस प्राइमरी इमेजिनेशन. अब सिर्फ पोएट ही है जो उस पर काम करेगा इन द सेंस व्हेन ही सीज अ ब्यूटीफुल सीन, automatically he jumps up with joy, he gets excited, and in his excitement he writes a few lines. तो ये सेकेंडरी इमेजिनेशन है जिसको सोर्स मिला प्राइमरी इमेजिनेशन से और पोएट ने एक सुंदर सी ब्यूटीफुल कविता लिख दी उस पर. So it is the work of the conscious will and intellect. Secondary imagination may be possessed by others too, but it is peculiar and distinctive attribute of the artist. It is an active agent which dissolves, diffuses, dissipates in order to create. ये secondary imagination बहुत ही active रहती है. It dissolves, diffuses, ये सब कुछ मिला जुलाकर प्राइमरी इमेजिनेशन की इमेजेस को एक सुंदर सा रूप दे देती है. And Goldridge has called it a magical synthetic power. He's also called it plastic. It is a plastic power which synthesizes all that is opposite. Imagination and fancy, two very different concepts which Goldridge has given is imagination and fancy. He's explained it very nicely with the help of scientific example of mixture and chemical compounds. Just like a mixture is there, in mixture, we mix many things together. The ingredients are mixed in such a way that they do not lose the individual properties. वो mix होकर सुंदर सा रूप बना लेगी, लेकिन individual properties अपनी नहीं छोड़ती. That is fancy. And imagination, as we discussed through primary and secondary imagination, it is a chemical compound. वो chemical reaction होता है when many ingredients are mixed together, but then they have lost their individual properties and they have it comes out to be something new and it is something beautiful for the external world. Fancy is not creative. It is merely a mechanical juxtaposition and not a chemical fusion. Fancy chemical fusion नहीं है, वो सिर्फ चीजों को इकट्ठा करके उसे सुंदर दिखा देती है. For Coleridge, fancy is the drapery or dress of poetic genius, but imagination is the very soul, which forms all into one graceful and intelligent whole. The willing suspension of disbelief. No concept has been so popular as willing suspension of disbelief. Now, what is willing suspension of disbelief? ये हम सब ने experience किया है willing suspension of disbelief. ये Coleridge का बहुत ही बड़ा contribution है literary criticism में. The meaning is that we willingly suspend our disbelief in order to enjoy a creative work of the poet or the artist. The temporary acceptance as believable of events or characters that would ordinarily be seen as incredible. ये वो acceptance है. हम जैसे कोई movie देखने जाते हैं which is sci-fi or which has got some supernatural theme. So we willingly suspend our disbelief. हमें पता है ये सब कुछ असली में नहीं हो सकता and in ordinary life it is impossible. But for some time we suspend our disbelief. हम अपने judgment को थोड़ी देर के लिए सोने भेज देते हैं और उसको enjoy करने लगते हैं. This is basically willing suspension of disbelief. It is temporary acceptance. थोड़ी देर के लिए हम मान लेते हैं कि ये सच है. the temporary acceptance as believable of events or characters that would ordinarily be seen as incredible. This is usually to allow an audience to appreciate works of literature or drama that are exploring unusual ideas. ये इस इनफैक्ट हम कोई भी ऐसी मूवी या कोई भी ऐसा वर्क ऑफ बेस्ड ऑन सुपर नेचुरलिज्म मैजिक रियलिज्म उसको एक बार नहीं हम इसको दो दो तीन तीन चार चार बार देखते हैं इसको एंजॉय करने के लिए वी आर सो मच एंजॉयिंग इट. Some very famous examples from literature are The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Christabel and Kubla Khan. These are all the examples which deals with supernaturalism. Well, I hope you all have enjoyed the lecture and it has been very beneficial for you. So I would like to thank you all for a patient hearing. Do kindly subscribe, like, and share the channel. Thank you.